Great. Well, welcome everyone to the 11th Anne Klibanski Visiting Lecture Series. My name is Louisa Sylvia. I'm the Director of the Office for Women's Careers within the Center for Faculty Development here at Mass General. In today's session, we have our very own Dr. Kelleher and Dr. Angela Gibson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who are going to be talking about the definition of success in academic surgery. And I cannot wait for this talk. Before we begin with the formal presentation, there are a few announcements I'd like to make. This session will be recorded and made available on the CFD website as a webinar and a podcast. We ask that everyone please complete the online evaluation form that will be sent out after this session. For those of you who will claim CME credit, please note that on this slide, Drs. Kelleher and Gibson have disclosed their financial relationships and have no conflict with today's lecture. Please text this SMS code in bright red to the phone number listed to mark your attendance with the CPD office. They will send you the evaluation via text. You must, again, complete the evaluation to receive credit. So this, Dr. Miriam Bradella, who's the director of the Center for Faculty Development, really had this wonderful idea of creating the Anne Klibanski Visiting Scholar Award just before the pandemic, because the pandemic was disproportionately affecting women, especially those in terms of being able to give presentations, to be able to collaborate and network with one another. And this award allows women across Mass General to have the opportunity to collaborate with one another, to have speaking opportunities, and really do grand rounds, visiting professorships. It's really been a wonderful opportunity. And we now have 68 phenomenal women, clinicians, educators, researchers, again, across the hospital who show promise as leaders, Dr. Kelleher being one of those leaders today. And as a result, we've had a great response from our scholar awardees who've noted that this has been really helpful in terms of helping them to, again, network, have new talks, and learn from each other. So it's been a wonderful opportunity that continues on today. And it's named after Anne Klibanski, who's our president and CEO of Mass General Brigham. She was the former director of the Center for Faculty Development. And she currently, and she's a former head of the neuroendocrine unit, and she's an extremely successful scientist practitioner and really leading the way for many of our women faculty across the institution. So we're thrilled to have this named in her honor. As I mentioned, we have Dr. Kelleher there in the red box, who's our Anne Klibanski Scholar today, who's going to be speaking. And these are some of our partnering organizations that have both done these Visiting Scholar Awards with us and also who have hosted some of our Anne Klibanski Scholar Awardees. And today we have University of Wisconsin there highlighted in the red box. And these are our new awardees. So again, we kind of keep it going. So this is the group that's going to be doing talks over the next year. So please keep an eye out for these email announcements because we're thrilled to have people attend and be a part of the discussion and support our women faculty. And this is the lecture series, which is the series dedicated to both having the Anne Klibanski Scholar and a visiting scholar do a talk together. And again, that's what we have Dr. Kelleher and Dr. Gibson today doing this joint lecture. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful speakers. We have Dr. Kelleher, as I said, who's here at Mass General, a pediatric surgeon. And the title of her talk is The Path to Success and a Long Winding Road. And I can't wait to hear about her long and winding road. Dr. Kelleher trained at Harvard Medical School, completed general surgery residence at Brigham and Women's and her pediatric surgery fellowship at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada. She's a surgical director of the fetal care program and neonatal ICU and is the quality chair for pediatric surgery at Mass General Hospital for Children. Dr. Kelleher's research focuses on surgical appropriateness and equity in surgical care and medical practice. Very busy person. And so is Dr. Gibson, who graduated from as a medical scientist training program from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, where she also completed her surgical residency. Subsequently, she completed 2 burn fellowships at the University of California and University of Wisconsin. Dr. Gibson is the founder and medical director of the Wound Healing Service at UW Health. Her research interests focus on epithelial regeneration and burn injury, evaluation of advanced tissue products, human skin model development for wound healing, and understanding the burn wound microenvironment. Thus, Dr. Gibson is an expert in both trauma and burn, emergency surgery, and critical care, as well as complex wounds. And she is going to be speaking today about Love the Skin You're In, My Approach to Tenure as a Surgeon Scientist. Love that title. So we talked a little bit earlier. What we're going to do is have Dr. Kelleher kick it off for us, and then we are going to have all of the questions and discussions after Dr. Gibson. So Dr. Kelleher will go first, then Dr. Gibson, and then we'll hopefully have some time at the end for discussion and questions. However, if you have a burning question or comment, in the meantime, please do put it in the chat and we'll try and get to it at the end. So with that, I will pass the baton to Dr. Kelleher.
Thank you. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I really have loved the Anne Klibanski series. I've learned a lot of things aside from meeting a lot of people around Mass General who I've become friends with. And I think that Dr. Gibson and I are excited about this talk because it's a little bit of a different thing, but something that we really found kinship in. And that's the definition of success in academic surgery. Our plan for, Dr. Gibson has received some research funding from Mallinckrodt, and I have nothing to disclose. Today, we are planning to talk about some challenges that face surgeon scientists, especially women, and we're going to go over those by sharing with you our journeys and our struggles in our academic pursuits, and maybe consider how to redefine success in academia for those people who are coming after us, but also for ourselves. Like Louisa said, I'm going to talk to you about how the path to success is a very long and winding road. So my long and winding road began in Placerville, California, a town of 4,000 people at the base of the foothills in Northern California. Everybody I knew rode the bus for an hour to our high school, and most of the people there graduated and either went on to have children and work or maybe went to junior college. I was one of those people who went to junior college, also called community college, and I had always wanted to be a doctor, so I was lucky enough to then go to the University of California at Davis, which was about an hour and a half from where I grew up. When I was at Davis, I did some basic science research and really fell in love with it. And I decided at that time that I thought it would be a good idea to be a surgeon scientist. And in order to do that, I was going to go to Harvard Medical School, even though everybody told me that I shouldn't waste the $80 it took to apply, because I was never going to get in, because there had only ever been one other person from UC Davis to go to Harvard. But like I often do, I ignored the sound of reason and I applied anyway. And even though I went to my interview on the wrong day, they somehow accepted me and I went off to Harvard Medical School. This is what happened when I got there. Imposter syndrome. I can't tell you what it felt like to be from a town of 4,000 people, having gone to junior college and wind up at Harvard Medical School and in the big city of Boston and go to places like Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I was terrified, and I was sure, in fact, it may still be the truth, that somebody messed up on the rolls and admitted me to Harvard Medical School on accident. We all suffer from imposter syndrome at some point in our lives, and the onus is on all of us to recognize that we all come from different places, we all have different backgrounds, and we all deserve to be wherever we are for one reason or another. It's taken a really long time to learn that, but I don't want it to take everybody else that long. And you know what? It turns out that I actually am a meerkat. So when I was at Harvard Medical School, there was so many people that I was in awe of. And in my goal of becoming a surgeon scientist, I recognized that there was the sort of pinnacle of the surgeon scientist right in front of me, named Dr. Patricia Donahoe. And so I decided that when I grew up, I wanted to be just like Dr. Donahoe. And I wanted to be like Dr. Donahoe because she was successful, the actual definition of success. She's a pediatric surgeon. She was the chief of a surgical division. In fact, the first woman chief of a division at MGH. She was the first woman full professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School. And she's been NIH funded for decades and decades. Not only that, but she identified a gene that is responsible for sexual differentiation in humans. And she's taught and mentored hundreds and hundreds of people. Dr. Donahoe is the epitome of the triple threat. For those of you who have been in the academic realm, you know that means it's a chief or chair of a department. In my life, it's a surgeon, and it's somebody who does basic science. It's not a clinical scientist, it's a basic scientist. That's a successful person. That is the definition of success. And so I went on to residency program. I did a fellowship. I did 2 years of basic science in the protein chemistry lab when I was a resident. And then I came back here to work in Dr. Donahoe's lab at MGH to study lung development. So I was well on my way to becoming my own triple threat. And I started working on the love of my life, newborn lung disease. This is kind of a evolving public health crisis because we are delivering babies so much earlier now that we really have a lot of young children with really horrible lung disease. And my goal in life was to cure this. And because there was no way to study this really aside from in small humans, I made an in vitro model of lung disease, the first one that was ever made and is still being used today in academia to study alveolarization. So I was doing it, I was actually making it. But something happened, I took a big turn. And I'm going to tell you about that after Dr. Gibson tells you about some of her struggles. Oops, there you go.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. All right. So thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my journey and to talk alongside Dr. Kelleher. It was really exciting when we first got to talking how similar our struggles have been. And so I'm going to go over my journey as I approach application for tenure as a surgeon scientist. And in reality, I'm going to talk about the struggles and the tears and the triumphs, because I think that's the more important lessons to learn and that hopefully you guys can take away from it. So my story started about 23 years ago. I was a brand new nurse here at University of Wisconsin. I was working on the burn unit for 4 months. It was a beautiful April day and Sunday afternoon. And I got a call from our nurse manager saying, you need to come in right away. There's been a horrible accident. There was a mentally ill man who boarded a Madison Metro bus with a bucket full of gasoline, and he went on to douse the occupants of the bus with the gasoline and lit it on fire. In that moment, everyone on that bus, their lives were changed forever, and so were those of us who were involved in caring for them for the next year. And so that experience basically thrust me into pretty intense care of these burn patients. 2 of the most intensely burned patients were engaged. Actually, it was a man and woman in their 20s. They were burned over 93% and 86% of their bodies. So you can imagine they went through a lot to get through that. We had, trying to figure out how to cover their bodies with skin when you only have a very small percentage left to use as donors. The organ failure that sets in. I distinctly remember I got to take care of both of those individuals quite a bit during that year that they were in our unit. And I distinctly remember having to take the woman to her husband's bedside to say goodbye to him because we thought we were going to lose him. So it's pretty intense experience. And I'm so excited to say that we were able to get all of the victims from that bus fire out and healed and on their way to recovery after about a year of taking care of them. Learned a ton about critical care, about wound healing, and also recognized that there was a lot to be done in the field of wound healing in burns. So our burn unit got a little slow after that year's worth of intense work, and I actually got a little bored. I wanted to figure out what else I could do with my schooling and education so that I could continue to feel that thrill that I felt as we were learning new things. And so that goes back to the late 90s. As I was that nurse, burn surgeon at the time, his name was Mike Schur, and he was at that time being approached by Dr. Alan Hoffman, who was a professor of keratinocyte biology on our campus. And she had actually reached out to him to say, hey, I discovered this immortalized keratinocyte cell line, and I'm creating artificial skin or skin substitute with this cell line. And I'm trying to graft it onto mice, and I want to know how you guys do your wound care. And so she wanted to learn how she could use bandages to get her skin substitute to stick on the mice. And Dr. Schur at the time thought was pretty intrigued by her discovery and said, you actually need to come to our unit and to see our patients to see what your product could potentially, or what your discovery could have an impact on our patients. And so she actually came into one of the surgeries and watched him try to figure out how to get a very large burn covered with the current technology we had available. She talks about that as her epiphany moment, and how that she pivoted from doing environmental toxicology with her keratinocytes to developing the skin substitute, which now just got FDA approved this year, over 20 years after the initial discovery. So it takes a really long time. So my epiphany moment was in watching the two of these people try to talk to one another about what each other needed and what each other could do. And I realized that there was a kind of a lack of the ability to hear or understand what each other could provide. And that was my epiphany moment, where I thought this is where I could go. If I got both education in medical school and in graduate school, I could be that translator between these types of people and really help translate these discoveries to our patients. So kind of fast forward, I did my PhD in Dr. Ellen Hoffman's lab. That was pretty exciting to be able to continue on. Having met her, she's a fantastic mentor, amazing woman who started her own company, spin-off company based on this technology. What I ended up doing in the lab was take these keratinocytes and overexpress a host defense peptide we basically created antimicrobial skin, and tested that in an animal model. That hasn't ever made it obviously past that point. The baseline skin substitute is the one that's actually FDA approved now, but it was still a really exciting project. And it also allowed me to stay involved and watch how discovery goes all the way to clinical approval. So I then continued, I've done all my training at the University of Wisconsin, so I was able to stay in close contact with Dr. Ellen Hoffman as she was developing the company and developing the technology. Did my burn and critical care fellowship. I did a mini burn fellowship at UC Davis, actually. So Dr. Kelleher, you and I have some connection again there. And then started my assistant professorship in 2015 on the tenure track. I would say that I was given a lot of support, and this was due to the great leadership that we have at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Minter is our chair of surgery, and she is fantastic, will give whatever support is needed if you have passion about what you're doing. And then my division chief, Dr. Zarzer as well. So I would say that I can't blame the lack of support here at the University of Wisconsin, because it's been pretty amazing. But despite that, there are still challenges. And so as I was preparing for this talk, I did a official Google search on what the current state of surgeon scientist was, just to get a feel for what the publications were saying about our field. And I thought it was kind of funny. There's all these little funny sayings, a dying breed, and the journey, inspiration, roadblocks, and resilience, and dynamic equilibrium, developing a roadmap. We even contributed a little bit after doing a survey of chairs of surgery and new faculty, and kind of seeing where the disconnect was and people who didn't feel that they were being supported. So there's a lot of publications out there that just go, support the fact that this is an important field, but there's a lot of challenges with it. So I'm just going to summarize a couple of the points from all of these papers and what I would call the bottom line in academic surgery. And I agree with Dr. Kelleher that it is a long and winding road. And, a lot of times for women, and for men, this is during the childbearing times of our lives. And so you either have to kind of take a little break, fit it in, find your support somehow to be able to enjoy both aspects of your lives. I would say, unfortunately, this field is also challenged with burnout, depression, and isolation. And I think that, the point of this lecture series in trying to support women and faculty with small kids in this challenging time that has become even more apparent with the pandemic shows that this is ever more a problem for junior faculty and people with small kids. In general, academic surgery, getting funding for that is ridiculously hard. I will show you some of my struggles that I've had, just to be completely honest with you, and to show that we have to keep trying, but it's hard. So I think you always think about falling back on the fact that it's so much easier just to operate to support your salary. But if you've got that passion to do the research, it's just recognizing that it's hard and that you got to stick with it. And then finally, I would say on this kind of theme, you need to have mentorship and resources in order to be successful, but that's not enough, I would say. You need to set some goals and expectations. And a lot of these articles talked about working hard, and setting those goals and expectations from your work, mentorship and menteeship relationships. But also I would say you need to do that within your family life. I think when we don't do those, expectation setting and goal setting, we start to lose people because it doesn't meet up with their reality. And I think we're losing ranks both from a junior faculty standpoint and our senior mentors. And that's kind of a circular problem, because if our junior faculty don't have senior mentors to look up to, they're never going to see where they can go. One of the problems that I think I've seen in a lot of these articles is that we're really still framing success as a basic scientist. A lot of, especially a lot of the funding, opportunities are all, wanting to know mechanism, everything. And I would say that I don't know that that's the only thing that a surgeon scientist can contribute. And I think we have a lot more that we can contribute without diminishing the importance of those things from other people who can contribute those. So overall, these articles definitely talk about the struggles, but they also point out that there's a need and a place for surgeon scientists. So starting out with my struggles, my first struggle was mentorship, trying to figure out who I could find as my mentor. When I was in grad school, Dr. Alan Hoffman said, this area of your research, if you want to take this from my lab and start to develop this, you go ahead. She was so supportive. She wanted me to be successful. Unfortunately, where her company was at that time and where the skin substitute development was at that time, because it was then bought out by industry and there was, as they were going to doing clinical trials and FDA approval, I couldn't touch that stuff. That research I just couldn't be involved in at that time from an academic standpoint, because it was connected with industry and there's all these bad connotations about connections with industry. And so I had to abandon that line of research that I really was banking on doing. Although Dr. Alan Hoffman has continued to be a mentor for me throughout the years, she couldn't be that direct mentor, like embedded in her lab, that is the most successful way to, I think, launch someone. And so what I really felt like was that, like, I was out on an island. I didn't really know anyone who could help me through this initial startup of my lab. And that was pretty lonely until I started to turn around the way that I thought about it. And I realized that I could actually start from scratch. And nobody could tell me what I should study or what I should do, and I could develop it myself. While that was a lot more challenging, it definitely is a lot more rewarding. And so that's what I ended up doing. I had to come up with my question, and my question was based basically on what I see clinically. We have all these wound patients and burn patients, and we have all these new products coming down the pipeline, and we don't really know how to determine what is the right product for the right wound. And so I wanted to start to develop how we can diagnose a wound and really identify what it needs, and then be able to test that well. And so in doing that, I need to think about what model that I needed to use in my lab. The main wound healing models that people do research on are rodents and pigs. Rodents because they're cheap and easy, and pigs because they're the most similar to humans. I would argue that they both have their challenges in trying to translate, and we really have a lack of human models to understand microenvironmental factors. And so that's where I really started to focus the initial part of my setting up my lab. And then I realized that as a surgeon scientist, I've got my patients. I've got my burn patients that I can get samples from. And then also I became someone who people wanted to collaborate with because I had that connection to the patients. And so other labs that had really well-established models wanted to partner with me and move our research forward faster because we could do that collaboration. The thing that collaboration has allowed as use of these multi-level models, and I really think that this is the way research needs to go. I think there's obviously benefit of doing things in cell culture because it's fast and easy and you can dissect it down to a single cellular mechanism, but it's really far away from the likelihood of translation to humans. It's also really important to be able to truth our research in humans, but we can't be doing experiments on humans too. So there's, a cost benefit of all these models, and the collaborations that I've been involved with have allowed me to use all of these models for wound healing, which has been pretty exciting. The second big struggle that isn't totally not talked about at all is how to run a lab. Like the actual, you have a business when you have a lab, when you have your own lab. And I totally did not learn that in graduate school. I know Dr. Ellen Hoffman did try to give me little pearls of information, and I do remember a lot of that, but it wasn't like okay, how do I budget a grant, the spending for a grant, and how do I do a performance review for one of my lab members? It's all these little things. So I think that was a huge wake-up call when I first started. And I would say I really was frugal at the beginning of my research career because I was afraid of running out of my startup funds before I had any good models developed. And I realize now that you have to spend money in order to make money. And I mean that being, you have to spend that money on those initial experiments and that to get that preliminary data to write the papers that are the currency that show that we're successful for getting the grants. And that I learned a little late, but luckily was able to hire my full-time scientist that works with me, Dr. Aiping Liu, who is really the glue that holds our lab together, especially when I'm on clinical service that's really busy, or I'm being asked to do administrative stuff that's taking me away from the basic science. So I would just strongly suggest that, you spend the money early on, and that will help you be successful. In order to spend the money, though, you have to have some money, and so you have to get some funding. That also has been an incredibly painful experience for me that I'll just briefly review. So of the 20 plus grants that I tried, as I was going through my records trying to figure out how many grants I've applied to, it's been over 20. I've only had 4 funded. Now I've enjoyed the freedom of doing the research for all 4 of those grants, and they've been all really fantastic funding opportunities, but it's a pretty low percentage of success for me. Additionally, when you look at the NIH grants that I've applied to R21 and then R01 5 times over for the same project, and another R01 that I just submitted for the first time. And so I've had 0 of those funded out of 7. Now I've had 5 of the 7 discussed, which is happy. It makes me happy and stuff. So you can get the scores back, but if the money's not there, you can't do the research. This seems to be a problem with many people. The success rate for NIH research project grants is about 20%. And the big problem is that the applications keep going up and the awards stay about the same. That's from the NIH data book. Furthermore, if you look at the age of PIs with R01s in the 1980s with the blue lines here, you can see that they were much younger. And now it's taking a lot longer either for people to get through all of their training or for them to actually be successful with RLN funding. So you see that this was in 2010. I'm sure the shifts even further to the right if we looked at current data. In 2020, the NIH R01 success rate for a first-time PI was 17% versus an established PI, which is 21%, which just goes to show you that it's much easier to get repeated funding after you've shown successful funding. So one way that I've tried to combat this is by doing more of that collaboration and combining unique expertise for this kind of team science, partnering with someone who's more senior, who has experience, learning from them to learn how to write a grant and how to respond to reviewers, all of that. And I was lucky enough to be approached by Dr. Zhudong Wang, who is a professor in engineering. He's actually a world expert in nanotechnology, and he's developed this little device here, this bandage that is a combination of a nanogenerator, which creates voltage to drive the electric field across this electrode here. And when he first came to me, he showed me some results with a rat that he had put this nanogenerator on, and it used the body motion of the rat's breathing to drive the electric field. And so the electric field is what got set up across the wound. Our body normally has an electric field when we wound to direct cell migration and proliferation. And so the thought was that increasing and enhancing that electric field would enhance wound healing. And he showed some pretty convincing data, enough so that I thought this is a pretty cool collaboration, and he's a pretty well-established professor on campus. But I pointed out to him that rat skin heals much differently than human skin, and that I think it's best to move this as fast as we can into a human model if possible. And so we were able to collaborate, and we grafted mice, immunocompromised mice with human skin, as you can see here in the figure. And we treated them either with just the nanogenerator not hooked up to the electrode, or the electrode hooked up to the nanogenerator. So the bottom panel here is the electrical stimulation that's been applied over 7 days. And you can see there's a significant improvement in wound healing. And when we look at it histologically, it actually recapitulated normal skin architecture. So very cool results. And as we've been doing these experiments, you continue to apply for funding. So as we were getting more and more positive results, we continued to apply for funding. I'm just going to review the challenges we've had with getting funding for this, what I think is a very exciting project. In the 2018, when he first approached me, we thought we'd put an R01 for this. I went in as a co-I because, I was pretty junior and didn't have any experience with that. And he was taking the lead on it. And it was fantastic for me because it was a great learning experience. We got some, decent scores. It was discussed. It was, good to have a decent score, but we knew we had to turn it around and resubmit it. As we got to planning for the resubmission, I recognized that I actually had a much greater role on it. And I just asked him if we could go in as multi-PIs, because I knew it would mean a lot more for my tenure if I was actually a PI on the grant rather than just a co-I. And so we revised it, submitted it. Our scores were a little bit better. We were happy. We thought, okay, we'll get this at some point. We're getting closer to the pay line. And then I realized that as an early stage investigator, new investigator, that I would get a little bump on the pay line for funding if I went in as a sole early stage investigator. And so he was very gracious enough to say, yep, you take the lead, you can write it, you can direct it. And so I got a little experience in, really pulling together a whole big R01 package, but I had the benefit of having had some versions before. So it's kind of a way of mentorship that wasn't really a clear, defined mentorship, but it was a fantastic learning opportunity. I then said, hey, this looks like this might be going to the wrong study section. We should switch study sections because I think we need one that understands the surgical need a little bit better. So we went to SAT thinking that they would grasp the surgical need for a little bit better. And lo and behold, it didn't get discussed. So that was a bit of a downer, and made me realize that I was still a little bit junior and didn't have the experience in grantsmanship that say more senior people had. So we turned it back around, revised it again, and resubmitted it back to the same study section we first submitted it to. Got, again, pretty good scores. As an ESI, I think I was pretty close to the funding pay line there at 19%, but still not fundable. And so we had some amazing comments of 2 of the reviewers, and then one of the reviewers was kind of off the wall, but we figured we'd address all the comments. I was really hopeful. This is just this past month, get the reviews back, and it was worse. And so this was quite a devastating, and this was a couple of weeks ago. So this was what in my mind is the definition of insanity for grant writing. And it really makes you kind of think about, what are you doing here, and what's the point of all this? And as frustrating as this was, a couple of weeks ago when I got these scores back, as much as I've thought about it, I realized I still do really love the research, and I just need to be more creative about where I submit this grant to. So I did find this article, so I'm going to put a little happy news out there. I did find this article that was recently a combined effort of people at the NIH and American College of Surgeons, and they focused on surgeon scientists and funding at NIH, and they found that there is a significant increase in percentage of funded surgeons. I will point out that their increase is 0.5 to 0.7% of funding is surgeon scientists, but it's positive. They did notice that there's an increase in K awards for surgeon scientists and a decrease in R awards. And they noted that they think this is related to an increase in the pipeline. So there's more surgeon scientists that are coming down the pipeline. I would add that I'm a little worried it's an increased attrition if we're seeing decrease in the R awards. So I think we just have to kind of be cognizant of that. They did find that basic science funding is flat for surgeon scientists, but it's not decreasing, and that clinical outcomes and clinical trials funding are increases. So this, I think, in my mind, is positive because I think it's seeing that there's more that surgeon scientists can bring to the table. They do point out in their paper that these data challenge the notion that surgeon scientists are more severely threatened than non-surgeons, and highlights their tenacity and fortitude in the face of significant clinical, administrative, and economic pressures. So I think that's a very valid comment. But there's still an uphill battle, as there always are. In 2019, this article pointed out that females received fewer grants and for less money than their male counterparts, and then even pointing out it's more dismal for the underrepresented minority surgeons. And when they looked at the data, this wasn't accounted for by sex distribution. I like how this paper did bring up some potential solutions. So, I'll talk about, if you're going to complain about something, you should try to look at developing a solution for it. And so they thought possible fixes could be targeted applications for women and underrepresented minorities, or using a blinded review process. So I think those both would potentially help with that problem. So again, my approach to the definition of insanity that I showed you was creativity and persistence. So I'm going to change NIH's grants.gov to say apply, 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 because that's what I feel like we have to do. But you can also go to different mechanisms, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense. You can go to surgical societies. Unfortunately, the Burn Association is too small of a society to really have the funds to support any real big research, but different cancer societies. You can reach out to the philanthropic societies that we know. They often, fund specific areas that they're interested in. And one area that I've been pretty successful in is our actual institution pilot funding and kind of incubator funding. And this has been wonderful because this is what sustained me as I've been continuing to apply for these grants. And then finally, I think we can't forget about investigator-initiated funding from industry. Again, that whole industry connotation often leaves an icky taste in people's mouths because of thinking that you're being bought out by industry. But when you look at investigator-initiated funding, you drive the research. They don't have any say in what you're doing. And so I think that's a very real way to think about supporting your funding. So the way that I've been able to sustain myself through the challenges with funding is to amplify the impact with all the diverse collaborations. I mentioned my project with engineering, with the nanogenerator electrical stimulation bandage. I've done a lot of work with various different people on campus as I've been trying to develop the human models that we use. And then with that, we've recognized that there are opportunities to enhance their research as well as we're using these models. When I wanted to start to think about using pigs in my research, they're super expensive. And so I was like, well, what breed do I use? And how do I burn them? And what's the model that I use? And I realized that there is no consensus to that. So we convened a panel of everyone who's doing this research, who are the leaders in our burn field. And we defined it for ourselves because we like I said, if you want to complain about something, you need to put your foot in the ring and actually make some change. And then finally, I don't think that we need to be so fearful of the industry connection. I don't receive any funds from the industry papers that I put together. This is all based on the fact that I care about my patients and I want to make sure that the products that are coming out are actually going to be used in the correct way with our patients and that they can get the maximum benefit. So I think it's important to partner with them so that they're not trying to sell you something that really isn't going to work. And then finally, this final struggle that I'm currently facing right now is whether or not to continue on with tenure. I think that, all the things that I've been successful at, I think are, positive for the tenure track, but the funding challenges are real and that becomes a big struggle. And so I think when you're thinking about if you should do tenure track or not, you need to just consider all of these things. You need to make yourself a chart. So I sat down and made myself a chart of what's important to me and what's important to tenure. And for me, it's the clinical relevance, impacting patients through research, enhancing translation between the basic and clinical research. I think that's such a cool role that we have as surgeon scientists, that we can kind of bridge that gap. I love the training the next generation. I love having residents in my lab. I love, the residents that I work with in the surgical wards. But I really think we need to make surgeon scientists relevant for what they have to offer. And sometimes I don't think that that's appreciated in the whole tenure path. So what's important for tenure is, you got to establish a niche and become a national expert. You got to publish, obtain funding. It also includes educating the next generation, although I don't think that they also always recognize what we as surgeon scientists do for education and how impactful that is. So we need to work on changing that in the tenure field. And then looking at outreach. The things that are not important to me, honestly, are the whole tenure, the whole word tenure. That means nothing to me. I think that it's important for certain, aspects of advancing your career, but in reality, if these things that are in the important to me box are met, then I'm, satisfied and I feel fulfilled. I also recognize that my burn research is not going to be published in Nature or Cell. It's just not that widely applicable to everyone to reach that, but I'm okay with that as well. The things that are not important for tenure that I have to reconcile is that clinical work. I'm very interested in the clinical work, and I'm interested in that bouncing back and forth between a clinical question and bringing that to the lab. And so that takes a lot of time in the clinical work, and that takes you away from doing your research. I also think that we shouldn't, like I mentioned before, the industry relationship shouldn't be such a bad connotation. And I think that if we continue to have struggles with funding from a national standpoint or federal standpoint, we're going to have to reach out to the federal or to industry to help us get the research done. And so, obviously I do care so much about the research still, and I'm loving what I'm doing. And so I'm going to pursue on for continue on the tenure track. But I think these are all important things to kind of come to terms with in your life as you're approaching that question. So I think we need to redefine our unique role as surgeon scientists and continue to do that. I would say that it goes back to how I felt like I needed to bridge the gap between the basic science and clinical reality. And that's where I thought my role would be. And I still feel like that is what I get to do. And that's what actually brings me the most joy. And we need to stop trying to fit the square peg into the round hole. So I'm just going to leave you with my top 10 pearls of kind of what I've learned as I've gone through this pathway, and then I'll turn it back over to Dr. Kelleher. So I'd say you'll be given some protected time if you decide to do research, and protected time is awesome, except if you forget to protect it. And so people will keep encroaching on your time, and you are the only one that can truly protect your time. Continue or start out early with collaboration and continue to do it throughout your career. I early on was very nervous about collaborating with more senior people in our field. There wasn't really anyone at our institution who was doing what I was doing. And so I had to reach out to the people kind of at our society meetings. And I was very nervous being a junior faculty member doing that, but it has been wonderful. And then as I did that and became more successful there, it helped me do that here at the University of Wisconsin as well. And we've got a very collaborative environment, so it made it easier as well here, but just reach out and try. I mean, people can just say no, but otherwise I think it's a win-win for both people. You got to do the shots on goal. You will fail at 100% of the grants that you don't submit. So you got to just keep submitting them, as painful as this is. You got to learn when to say yes and when to say no. I think it's important. Both of those are just as important to learn how to do. It's harder when you're more junior to differentiate between the things you should say yes to and things you should say no to. And I would also say that if you've said yes to something that you then realize you just can't handle, it's okay to go back and say that you actually made a mistake and you need to back out of an obligation. But you need some mentorship to help guide you through those conversations. And I've had, my committee tell me, you just need to blame us. Tell them that your committee said you shouldn't do that. And so that's been very helpful as well. And once you're a few years into your career, you need to turn around and pay it forward to the person who's coming after you and really be that mentor for them. I know a few years in, you don't feel like you have that experience to be a mentor, but you do. You've got those few years of experience under your belt. And so you should pay that forward. I can't remember who said this first, but I love this saying. We're all juggling balls all the time. You just got to know the difference between which ones are glass and which ones are plastic to know which ones that you can let drop. So obviously for me, my family is my glass balls that I would not let drop. But there are some other things that are plastic that I'll let drop, and they'll bounce and I'll pick them back up when I've got the time. Early on, when I wanted to kind of redefine what my research question was, I had people tell me that I couldn't do what I was planning to do. And I'm glad I didn't listen to them. Just like Dr. Kelleher didn't listen in her realm either, that she wanted to continue on with what she was passionate about. Don't let people tell you can't do something just because it hasn't been done. You can just be that trailblazer to do it. And then with that, as I've mentioned a couple of times, make sure that you're a part of the change that you hope to see. Get involved, sit on the committees, as long as it doesn't encroach too much in your protected time, but have a stake in the game. In the same respect, you need to do a little periodic pulse checks. As a trauma surgeon, this is important for me. So you need to make sure that if you're finding that you are completely overwhelmed, check your pulse, make sure that you're not burned out, and back off of things if you need to. Same thing if you're, really hard working on a research project that kind of seems like it's dying, make sure that you either need to revive it or you need to let it go and pivot and move on to something else. And then finally, I would say, I think this past couple of years has absolutely shown us that life is very precious, and that above all, make sure you're happy and don't postpone joy. So thanks for listening, and I'll pass it over to Dr. Kelleher.
So I'm going to carry on in a similar vein. And just like you've heard about Angela's story, I'm going to tell you that my story has been very similar to hers. I continued on with my basic science research, and elastin is my favorite protein in the entire world. And I am certain that it has something very important to do with newborn lung disease. And I worked for several years in the lab on the role of elastin in newborn lung disease, and made some progress. And I also wrote some grants and had some similar struggles. So just in the time I was doing basic science, I applied for 12 grants, institutional and out of academia, and I got 3 of those. And I applied for 3 NIH grants, and I got none of those. And that was a little bit disappointing, in that after some amount of time, you run out of your startup package and you need to start to fund yourself. But nevertheless, I continued on in a similar vein because I knew that I wanted to make a big impact. And so I started to do a few other things as well, because I knew I needed to prove that I was worth something, so my basic science was a little bit slow. And I needed to do my citizenship duties, as they're called. And so I did a lot of leadership things, like I rolled out EPIC for the Department of Surgery for Mass General. I became the chair of quality and safety, and started the fetal care program at our institution, which now sees about 500 consults a year. I'm the director of the neonatal intensive care unit, and we started NISQIP at our hospital, and I became the champion of that. And I took on many and many more roles, and became one of the women's statistics, in that women do more work that is neither paid nor relevant for promotion than most of our male colleagues. And I fell immediately into this trap, as I am wont to do, because what I really recognized was that in these roles, I really had a way to impact my patients and a lot of people at once by doing quality work and by working hard in the fetal care program that I was maybe a little less likely to have when I was doing basic science. And something really unexpected happened. Dr. Lillamo hired a PhD to come work at the Codman Center for Clinical Effectiveness. And that PhD is an outcomes researcher. And he told me one day, Casey, I've hired David Chang, and he's going to do, how do I get the slides to advance? There we go. Pediatric surgery outcomes research with you. And I said, I don't do outcomes research. I'm going to be a triple threat, and it doesn't include outcomes. And I don't know how to do that. And I don't really want to do that. And he said, well, he's here. And so he's going to work with you a little bit. Let's see what happens. And so I found myself right here. I found myself in the middle of 12 different avenues of academia, administration, clinical work. I had 2 small children. And now I'm going to start doing outcomes research. And really what happened was my basic science lab spun out of control and crashed. It crashed and burned. Like, I stopped writing papers. I stopped making progress. I, wrote 3K grants, none of which got funded. And I started to do a whole lot of other things. And I realized at this point that it wasn't a threat at all anymore. It was a zero threat because it wasn't doing basic science and I had sort of failed and it felt really bad. It felt really bad. It took me a few years to get over this. And I still go back to the lab and want to watch talks about PCR and Western blots. But what happened was that I started to do some other things and I changed my perspective a little bit. What Angela calls this is a pivot. And I had to learn the hard way that it was time to pivot. And so after turning my head upside down and standing on my head for a while, I realized that there are some things that are really important to me. And lo and behold, the serendipity of Dr. Lillimo hiring a random PhD to do outcomes research with me really was a pivotal moment in my life because I care about benchmarking for pediatric surgery. And I really, really care about equity in surgical work and revising and revisiting some of the things that we've been doing for a really long time, like how do we do grant reviews? How do we think about tenure? How do we think about leadership in surgery or how to be a surgeon? And I'm very passionate about those things. And I have the opportunity to be successful in a different way than I ever thought possible. And so what I've done is start from a really unusual, tiny place at the very bottom of this long winding road. And I've gone on a bit of a journey through basic science and crashing my car and having a family. And I've come up to the top of this part of the winding road that you can see to a new venture in outcomes research. And what it really comes down to is that none of us ever get to this place higher up our road without scraping our knees and climbing and struggling. We struggle with imposter syndrome. We struggle with funding. We struggle with mentorship. But those of us who are finally successful keep going. We get up and go, and we just, wipe our hands off and keep climbing. And we recognize that we don't do this by ourselves. We do this with other people who help us along the way, like Angela, who's telling me her struggles and sharing with me, and Dr. Donahoe, who has taken me under her wing and said, you don't always succeed the first time you trying again. And what it comes down to is that we all have a long winding road and we're all climbing, but we get up and we do it. And these people have all done it. These are like the successful chairs of pediatric surgery around the country. And I can tell you that none of these people consider any of their titles their successes. They consider teaching, doing research on something they're passionate about, being the first person to do intra-op chemotherapy in children, fighting for bariatric surgery research and funding for children. And Dr. Diana Farmer in the top left does research in fetal surgery, which is amazing and outstanding and really pushing the field. And this is what these women are successful at, is finding their passion, continuing to drive forward and taking care of their scraped knees and crashed cars and getting up and going again. And so what I think that Dr. Gibson and I would like to do is sort of redefine what an academic success is. And it doesn't mean that it's not a triple threat, because it's still absolutely a triple threat, but it's not the titles of those triple threats. It's that these people work in something that they believe in, that they realize that their path is not the same as anyone else's, but ultimately you can get to a good place by continuing to go. And that sometimes we crash and scrape our knees, but we get up and we go again. And we recognize that the rewards that we have for ourselves and for our patients and for their families and our communities don't necessarily have a title in them. They can, and that's nice, but it's not the most important thing. And that sometimes there are serendipitous opportunities that you should take advantage of and listen to the people who maybe have been watching you and know you and want to help you. And if there isn't one of those that comes along, then you can make one. You can start a fetal care program, and you can start a pediatric surgery trials and outcomes research center. And if you don't know how to do that, find a champion, because they'll help you figure that out. And then you can be a champion for other people. And so hopefully, with understanding that we've all struggled and that we continue to struggle, you can also see us as successes and as successful for what we're going to do and what we've already done. And you can find your own successes in yourselves and realize that it's not just the titles. You don't have to be a triple threat, but you're a threat in your own way if you keep on climbing and working in what you believe in. So I think that I don't know exactly what time it is, but we'd be happy to answer questions or discuss other things. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to share our climbs with you.
Great. Thank you both so much. What a lovely combination of pearls of wisdom. I especially needed the grant funding journey that you both had. I just got a resubmission back that was scored lower than the first submission again. So you're paying Dr. Gibson. So it was, you know, it wasn't great to hear that, but I think your apply certainly at least reflects my experience. So unfortunately, we just have like a few minutes left. So please, if there's a question or two, please let us know. But I guess I would just like to sort of ask either one of you, what has been, you both spoke so highly of mentors and the importance of mentorship. And I just was wondering if you could speak to that as you see sort of the rising women faculty in your institutions, and advice on how people can seek mentorship and or how it worked for you a bit more. But I think that's such an important piece to this puzzle. I just was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess I would just comment that I think you can't expect one mentor to fill all of your needs. And so I have many, many mentors, and they kind of come and go depending on what I need at that time in my career. I've also had some really bad mentors, people that have been hooked up with me that I've realized have not been good for me. And when I let that relationship go, it actually freed me a bit. And I think it was freeing for both individuals, right? So just be honest with each other about that whole relationship.
I think the same thing. And one of the things that Angela and I have in common is that we both identified people that we thought were amazing and doing amazing things and latched ourselves on. Like, I know that Dr. Donahoe probably wouldn't think that I've like attached myself at the hip, but honestly, like, that was the way I found my first basic science mentor, and my mentor when I was doing research in residency. Is I looked for people who were inspiring and doing things that I was interested in, and I didn't look for the person who I could write the most papers with. That is absolutely not an academic surgical pearl, right? Like, that is not what people will tell you. But I honestly think that if you're doing the things you love with somebody who you work well with and like, then you're going to be way more successful than you are if you just put yourself somewhere where everybody expects you to be.
So well said. And we are running up against time, and there are so many comments coming in, just thanking you both for putting yourselves out there, for being genuine and transparent, for integrating both your losses and your gains, if you will, and how they've made you who you are today. So thank you both again. It was a pleasure having you. And again, if you do have questions, I'm sure these two would be happy to answer them offline. And thanks again for being here today, everybody. Much appreciated.
I think, Angela, we need a part B.
Yeah, right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.